Welcome to Candid Leadership. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My guest is Dr. MeMe Kraft, who holds a doctorate in public policy and administration with a concentration in Homeland Security policy and coordination. Dr. Kraft is a faculty member at the National Intelligence University and an adjunct professor at Tiffin University. She began teaching various student populations in 2010 and has over 230 hours of training in adult learning methods. Before full-time teaching, she served 20 years of active duty in the U.S. Army as an all-source intelligence warrant officer. She has provided strategic and operational intelligence analysis of nation-state and non-state threats to the United States interest, policy, data, and networks in and around Asia, Europe, and the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. But her research now includes community resilience, disaster risk reduction, leadership, impacts of disruptive technology, alternative futures, and post-normal times. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Kraft with us here today to really talk about her perspectives on how we lean forward into this future. Welcome to Candid Leadership, Dr. Kraft. You discussed in your research interest that one of the things you look at is post-normal times. Do you think we are there?
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you and on your podcast. Yes, to a certain degree, I do believe we are either in post-normal times or rapidly approaching post-normal times. That's essentially, a diversion from what the norm is, what typically we see occur and how things are changing. I would say that the probably easiest example of that would be the events that transpired January 6th. But that's not the only example, but I would say we are definitely rapidly approaching that environment.
Exactly. And I think that is definitely for discussion when we talk about kind of the information age and post-truth. Mm-hmm. That's an area that post-normal times really dives into. What a phenomenally interesting topic that is. I want to dive into, though, some of the topics that you've talked about in the past about mid to long-term planning. And you've talked about both. I've heard quite often black swans, but one I hadn't heard was black elephants. So can you kind of explain how, when we're looking at planning, especially those of us in both national security and intelligence field, we're looking forward and we're starting to plan the future. And what are those things out there from a managerial perspective that we could address and look for?
Yes. So as you mentioned, black swan is probably far more common than black elephant. But, the simplest way of explaining a black swan is an outlier with a high impact. But, some people often cite, with a low probability, whereas the black elephant is something that's extremely likely. More times than not, it's often simply ignored or not addressed. And so especially during the time of the pandemic, in my personal opinion, some of the issues that we may have seen from a leadership or managerial perspective that we simply said, or we pushed off and said, yeah, I know it's a problem, but we'll deal with that later, right? It's not the priority right now. We'll deal with that later. That's a black elephant. The fact that it is a problem and it was identified, just not dealt with, you could put that in a category of being ignored or at least pushed off. But I think from my perspective, this pandemic brings that to the forefront, especially if we were to think about some of the questions we could ask ourselves when dealing with black elephants would be, what are some of the trends that are currently embedded in a process that we know is getting in the way of doing something better? Some of that comes to fruition in this environment would be workspace. So let's say you work in an environment or in an organization where there simply were not enough desks and seats for everyone that worked there. So it was pushed to shift work, not because of the workload, but simply because there weren't enough people. But there's also the demand to continue to hire more people. In this environment where most of us are either in a hybrid environment or we're working from home, if we're not careful, someone can continue to push that off, but the pandemic is going to end and everyone's going to need to come back to work. That is a problem that will still exist and have actually gotten worse if that part's not being addressed, for an example.
I think that's a great example. I think you've written quite prolifically about Black elephants and managerial styles and how people get after these things. But I love the question that you ask, what do we not know? And we have uncovered in the year past so many different things that were really out there. I mean, these trends that were embedded in processes that had happened before, obviously, kind of our health environment itself. We knew it wasn't really safe always to shake hands, but we had known this for years. And other societies had changed kind of the way that they had different greetings. But we had a very embedded normalization of shaking hands. That it's just one small thing, but you were almost afraid or embarrassed to discuss that. Like, I really don't feel comfortable shaking people's hands. And boy, did we not change the perspective? So we've changed the perspective. We've changed the outcome in the way we do simple little things like that. The same thing with cubicle farms that we're really, really close to one another or, touching the same surfaces. That's just one small thing that you talk about with respect to Black elephants. And I appreciate that. You've written also other articles for Public Affair Times, and you've discussed learning from failure. And that, for my audience, is something, especially people going into their first or second jobs, we don't really talk about, but there's a tremendous amount you can learn from that. So how are some of the things and examples that you've learned to really grow in leadership about kind of, turning that corner and learning from failure, Dr. Kraft?
Yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly that especially for people that are just coming into the work environment and understanding, for me, I'm a firm believer that in order to succeed, there will be some failure. And failure should not always be associated with something that's very negative. Yes, it may be uncomfortable, but as I've written about, we all were accustomed to failure. If you think about how kids learn to walk, they will fall, but they will also get back up because they're determined to get the thing off the table that they had no business touching in the first place, right? But there's drive there, and you shake it off and you continue to do it. So from my perspective, I think part of being willing to go through the process of failure is knowing and appreciating, one, the journey, but two, the desired end state. If you're trying something new that you've never done before, then you will probably fail to some degree. And that's okay because you've never done it before. And I think from a leadership perspective or a managerial perspective, if we want our teams to be the best, to work very well together, to be cohesive, inherent in that process is going to be a little bit of failure. So, that evaluation, that feedback loop, those things I think are very important, not just for people entering the workplace, but those of us that have been around for a very long time. And as you know, the more you do things, the better you get at them, we hope. But sometimes because we become very accustomed to doing things well, we suffer the most when it comes to actually failing at something.
Right. And I think that really harkens on, you really have to try different things. If getting too comfortable, if you're in your comfort zone too long, and I always say, if you just look around and it's just too easy and you lose almost that sense of that little edge, that sense of fear, you're in a place where you've just stalled. And that plateau area is people who have been in a profession for multiple decades. I really encourage, try something remarkably new. This was something I started a year ago, this journey into, hey, let's grow different leaders from different aspects. I can tell you right now, even through this podcast, and that's why I encourage people to write to me, what are those areas that you've seen that you've grown, and what did you do different to get there? You've written in the past about resilience, MeMe, and I appreciate the fact that in your writing, not only do you talk about things that build up great leaders, but you also display a sense of vulnerability. And that is just spot on and key. And you talked about some of the, over the last year, the emotional, mental, physical, and social levels of change that we've experienced. But you've talked about resilience. Can you kind of share a story of resilience and things that have been impactful in your life and how that helped really build and shape you?
Yes, you're correct in the fact that I definitely, as I sit back and look, not only this year, but, if I were to look backward from the time I retired in 2018, just changing one's complete lifestyle and then realizing that you are now navigating in an environment you're not used to requires resilience in its simplest form. resilience is the ability to respond to change in a way that allows you to also adapt to it. So it used to be a definition when they say respond to and bounce back, but the reality is it's adaptive. You adapt. You're never quite back in the same position that you were before the event happened. A great example for me would be I retired in October 2018, right? So in that process, I moved to South Carolina to become a professor at Coastal Carolina University. And so I knew that South Carolina Conway is very close to Myrtle Beach. And so I knew, looking at the topography and everything else, that I did not want to live close to the beach because hurricanes, right? So I wanted to live inland. And I knew that I needed to find a house that was in flood zone X, which is no or low opportunities for floods, right? Low chance of flooding. So that's what I did. I thought that I was researching it in the right way, found a house that was inland, that was in an air quotes, no flood zone area, bought the house in July, and by September, my house flooded. So it was the post flooding that came after Hurricane Florence. And basically, because the hurricane stalled in North Carolina, what goes up must come down. So it essentially flooded all of the waterways leading to and through Conway, South Carolina. So there I was, someone who had deployed multiple times, who was, an advocate, air quotes, planner for, how I was going to live my life. And then I was faced with my home flooding. We had to evacuate. The house was underwater for about 10 days, and it incurred about between 10 and 12 inches of water, which, for FEMA, those are familiar with FEMA, that means you have to do a 4-foot cut throughout your entire house and take out everything and pretty much remodel. So everything was damaged, all like my refrigerator, not microwave, but refrigerator, cabinets, everything was pretty much damaged. All my furniture was damaged. Although I moved it up off the ground, mold and sitting in a dark, wet place for 10 days does damage. So my family, we lost about 90% of everything that we owned, basically had to start from scratch without, by the way, flood insurance. Because why would you buy flood insurance if you live in no flood zone? So, and the amazing thing about that story, though, is all of my research up to that point was about community resilience. My dissertation's on community resilience. I had done additional presentations about community resilience, especially during disasters. And even though I had that depth of knowledge from an academic, theory perspective, living through it and understanding the wave of emotions one goes through before, during, and after the particular disaster was mind-boggling. So just having to live through that, understanding the benefits of living in an environment where people come together very quickly and display a sense of unity was very helpful.
That is incredibly impactful. In so knowing also that theory and practice, I mean, you experienced both sides of that. Mm-hmm. And now you continue to teach on that. And I think that's really phenomenal. And we're really excited to have you here. And thank you for telling that story and the fact that you've worked to really bring people together in a lot of the work that you've done. Now, you're teaching in 2 different places. Is that correct now?
Yes, I'm a person that can't seem to sit still, but I'm very honored to teach at the National Intelligence University. I'm a contract faculty, so I work for Massey Group, but I am a faculty member at the National Intelligence University, the School of Science and Technology. So I teach a lot of cyber threat intelligence, cyber intelligence, intelligence collection, leadership and management, things of that nature. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Tiffin University, in which I teach, the intro to intelligence, some cybersecurity and homeland security type classes as well.
Well, thank you for continuing to add to the body of knowledge that's out there, and especially in intelligence studies as a field that continues to grow. We're big advocates here for that field. One area that I love that you write about quite a bit is also talking and speaking to social capital. And I know you've spoken in the past about really human capital and your 3 E's. Can you kind of go through those 3 E's of engaging, educating, and empowering, and how we could apply that to our workplace?
Yes. So I came up with the whole 3 E's when I was doing a lot of my research to talk about community resilience and how essentially to build up local communities so that we can be better prepared to, respond to disasters and just generally improve our sense of community. But the 3 E's for me, the whole engagement, education, and empowerment, to me transcends beyond the whole social change, advocate in me looking at it from community resilience, but also in leadership as well as parenting and teaching. Because ultimately, when I think about the things that matter to me from a leadership and management perspective is how am I improving the organization and the team? How am I leaving an impression on individuals that will far exceed my time in that organization that really speaks to improving the overall experience of people? And how am I engaging with them? If I'm in a leadership position, how am I ensuring that I'm setting the conditions for those individuals to feel as though they can engage with me? So not just their education, but also my education, and not just empowering them to try new things and to become better at their particular skill set, but also empowering me to have the freedom to look forward from a midterm to long-term planning perspective because I've empowered my team to do what they need to do. I'd take the same approach with parenting. Like my kid's 20 years old, he's almost 21. And as a parent, there's different stages in the way in which you can engage your child based on their age. But that education part is always there and always present. But then how do you empower your child to go out into the world and be a contributing member of society? And then I take the same approach with teaching. I'm very much an advocate of the adult learning techniques. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth, a lot of engagement, right? And then taking that ability to teach adults where it's not just educating them from a theoretical perspective or, having them read 60 pages of something, but it's that peer-to-peer learning, that experiential learning. And then how are they empowered then to take what they learn in the classroom, not just from the person standing at the front of the room, but all of their peers in that room? And how do they take that information and improve their organization or their team or themselves? So for me, the 3 E's just transcends so many different areas that I'm passionate about, if that answers your question.
No, I think that's phenomenal. And I think you have been not only engaging, and now your life you've spent educating in a multitude of different ways. And I do want to hearken to one storytelling time on Dr. Kraft. I had the distinct pleasure to serve that in the past. She talked about retiring in 2018, but prior to that time, in a land far, far away in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, Dr. Kraft and I served together. And the best part about Dr. Kraft is not only meeting her and seeing the way that she could transform a classroom, but the fact that she not only educated, she was a dynamic instructor, but the best part about seeing someone who is just completely and utterly tied into making her craft better, she empowered the people around her. And so one story we've kind of spoken about in the past, so I'll hearken you back to put on your uniform and kind of tell the tale of how you've seen sometimes leaders get to the point of maybe micromanagement and what you've had to do to kind of set the tone for someone that was in that to kind of, again, we all need to learn lessons. So isn't it best to learn something off a podcast and not in real life? So Dr. Kraft, if you could kind of walk through that one example we've spoken about in the past about even kind of leading up and leading down, how you set the example.
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much for the compliment. I definitely love teaching, so I really appreciate that anecdote that you provided. And I definitely had a lot of fun in Fort Huachuca. So the story that you're talking about was after I left Fort Huachuca, my next assignment. So I went into the senior analyst position. It is a position that I've held before. I am a retired warrant officer, so an all-source intelligence warrant officer. So it's quite common to fill that particular role. And so in the organization, we had an ACE chief. So for those of you that may not be familiar, ACE stands for Analysis Control Element. It's essentially the organization within a larger organization that is responsible for calling together all of the intelligence and providing pertinent information to policymakers and decision makers. So in that particular job, there was always something happening, always a requirement, usually something was with a short, timeline of when they needed it. And so we had a particular ACE chief. He was very personable. Oftentimes he would walk around and talk to the analysts and just, touch base with everyone. So I was working on this particular product that was pretty much completed, probably about 85-90% solution, completed by a particular team. And now it was sent to me as a senior analyst. I was essentially the last line of defense between the product and when it goes to the ACE chief for review. So by the time it leaves me, it should be at about a 95% solution, if not more. And for this particular assignment, it was a short suspense. And so he was doing his typical thing when he walked around and talked to individuals. And he came into our area. And at that point, I was actually reviewing the product that was going to be due to him probably within the hour or a little bit longer than that. And as he was walking around talking to everyone, I saw him come in. And by that time, he had been with us long enough for us to have gone through several short suspense items. And he was starting to get this reputation for the person that would come behind you as you were working on something and then provide their input, because we all know how much we love when that happens. So sure enough, he came into the area and he was walking around. So I could see him, based on the way I was sitting, I could see him come in. And so I was just like, okay. So I watched him move around the room in my peripheral while I was still doing what I needed to do to get the product ready for him. And so sure enough, he starts making his way towards me and he's like, "Hey, Chief, how's it going?" And I look over my right shoulder and I said, "Hey, sir, I'm doing good. How are you?" He's like, "Oh, pretty good." So then I saw that he cut from looking at my face to looking at my monitor. And he was about to say, "Hey, Chief, is that the..." So the whole time I'm looking at him and smiling, I'm looking at him over my right shoulder. I extend my left hand and I turn off my monitor. And he looks at me, he goes, "Chief, did you just turn off the monitor?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I did." He's like, "Well, aren't you working on that thing?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He's like, "Oh, I can't look at it?" I said, No, you can't." So he looked and he had this smirk on his face, somewhere between, "I can't believe she just did that," to, "I don't know, should I find it funny or should I be upset?" And so the whole time I'm smiling at him. And then I say, "Sir, did the task change?" And he said, "No." I said, "Did the time frame that you need it change?" And he was like, "No." I said, "Okay, well then you'll get it when I'm done with it." And so he looked at me and like the whole room's like snickering. They're trying not to laugh out really loud, but he looks at me. He's like, I said, "Hey, look, sir, I got to do my job. Let me do my thing. And then I'll get it to you. I'll get it to you before the suspense is up." And so he kind of like, put his head down. He's like, "All right, fine, Chief." And he walked away. But I was like, listen, I had to set the condition to say, we all have our role. The team that created the draft, they had a role. I have a role. He has a role. Let us each play our position so that we can get to the desired end state in, the requisite time with the requisite amount of detail based on that particular task.
That's a phenomenal story in the fact, and I love how you almost bring in everybody plays their position on the field, you score. But when you start to really, especially leaders, when you start to dabble in, and that harkens into that micromanagement area, then you're not playing your own position. I joke quite often with planners, if planners start to get into current operations and they stop looking forward into the future and they look at the here and the now, no one else moves into that forward-looking position. And that speaks directly to that great example you just gave of sometimes just making people simply by turning a computer screen off, but making someone aware of, hey, you're dabbling in an area that you just don't need to be in, and we need you to focus on the management, the leadership. I mean, time well spent. That is just a great example, and thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Kraft. I appreciate it. It has been phenomenal having you on here today. Is there anything else you want to add?
Sure. I was going to say that, in this particular example, to his credit, he was self-aware. And I think that's also important with the leaders and the managers, is to be self-aware so that you can readjust and allow the team to do what they need to do. And so he was aware, and over time, he was able to take a step back and let us do our job. And I think that's also important, is because if you're passionate about what you do, sometimes you may overstep, but if you're willing, if you have that intellectual humility and you're willing to acknowledge some of your faults because you are self-aware, then I think there's an easy possibility to self-correct and move back on the field where you belong and let everyone else play their position.
That's awesome. And what a way to end this episode of Candid Leadership. Dr. Kraft, I really appreciate you taking the time out today to talk through just a variety of different things. We've really talked about resilience. We've talked about looking forward and what's next, what post-normal things will change, and then also just hearkening to your 3 E's. I definitely appreciate it. I've learned a ton today, and I wish you the best of luck as you continue to educate and mold those young minds of the next generation coming forward.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about things that I'm very passionate about and that I really enjoy doing. So thank you very much.